Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel and the Gaza Strip in particular, but also throughout the region and beyond, it's always important to remember how the war began. 335 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched a surprise attack against Israel, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The next day, on October 8th of last year, the Iranians pretty much joined this war by greenlighting their proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, to launch cross-border attacks against Israel. Since then, Hezbollah launched thousands of rockets towards Israel, including barrages today. Thousands others were also fired from the Gaza Strip, from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen, including from Iran proper, which launched a direct attack between the 13th and 14th of April with some 320 projectiles towards Israeli territory. To deliberate the latest, let's now turn to TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you update us with on the latest?
Well, Jonathan, you keep reminding us of various milestones in the calendar. So just to refresh our memories, tomorrow night, September the 6th, or the night between the 6th and the 7th, is another anniversary, and that is the destruction of the North Korean nuclear reactor in Syria in 2007. And the Israeli Air Force still has a lot of capabilities which are being held in reserve for tasks which are much more awesome and challenging than what happens now. We haven't seen the full might of the Israeli Defense Forces and especially of the IAF. However, fighting goes on. You mentioned Gaza. In Gaza, especially Hamas, but also the Palestinian Islamic Jihad cells are trying to use forbidden sites which were naively set aside, such as the humanitarian areas, schools, mosques, and they are trying to plan their terror acts and execute them from these places. IDF intelligence, along with Shabak, the internal security agencies, a lot of times find out about them, and the Israeli Air Force and ground forces hit them where they are trying to hide. There are, of course, other firefights in Judea and Samaria. And just as an aside, Israeli forces are now quite stretched in all three fronts, major fronts, Lebanon, Gaza, and Judea and Samaria. But what we usually hear about is what the army is doing, the Air Force is doing, police and border patrol. But there are also other forces, other units. For instance, today the IDF has revealed that the Navy, especially some of the newer corvettes, have managed to intercept some of the aerial targets launched at Israel. And also in the West Bank, usually you hear about elite military or police forces. It turns out that even the Israel Prison Service, which has an HRT, a hostage rescue team, largely unemployed. You don't hear about prison riots, prisoners taking hold of guards and trying to bargain their way to freedom. So one of these units called Masada has taken part in one of the sweeps, the dragnets, in Judea and Samaria, and apparently distinguished itself in one of those. So Israel still has some resources to take from just in case the regular forces are overemployed.
Indeed, the Mitzada unit, a very capable unit that has proven itself, I don't think, for the first time in multiple special operations, particularly in Judea and Samaria. Of course, it's always good to have another special operations unit with the capacity of operating on a 360-degree employment on standby. That's something that, of course, not every country can afford itself. But nonetheless, let's turn now to Central Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Amnon Sofrin, formerly the Intelligence Director-at-Chief at Mossad. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you particularly about the current operations undertaken in the Gaza Strip. There is much happening, of course, when we're talking about the various efforts to not only conduct affairs in a manner that is aligned with international law, something that the IDF is very good at, but nonetheless to also, as Mr. Olin mentioned, to identify terror activities within designated humanitarian zones, which are exploited by those terrorists in order to, on the one hand, frustrate Israeli activities against them, but on the other hand, also, if they do engage them, to ensure that international media will allow certain images to emerge that then would increase international pressure against Israel from undertaking those very specific operations.
You know, when you fight guerrilla, and this is the mode of fighting right now in Gaza, it's not fighting against the organized battalions and brigades that were deployed prior to the war. Now it is small. There are small teams operating in Gaza in a guerrilla mode. And of course, guerrilla fights usually within what we call the civilian neighborhood, meaning trying to merge inside, not to be detected, just like it used to be before, wearing uniforms and so on. And the minute that this is the situation, you have to differ very carefully between uninvolved and involved people. And this is very complicated, and we try to do our best, but nevertheless, sometimes you cannot avoid hitting uninvolved people. The same goes in Judea and Samaria. It's the same problem with the same challenge, because people are fighting within civilian neighborhood. They use the mosques, they use the schools, they use every facility that has what we call civilian characteristics, and they fight from there. Now, the minute you try to get in, you are trying to differ between those people and the people that are living there in this neighborhood, and to differ between people that are uninvolved and try to avoid hitting them. But you can't always make it very accurate, and sometimes it happens that we have kind of what we call mistakes like that, and uninvolved people are being killed. Now, take for consideration, for example, what happens in Judea and Samaria. They use what they call side charges that are hidden beneath the roads. That means that somebody digged a big hole and inside it installed what we call the side charges. When the vehicles are approaching, they try to activate it from above. Now, the minute we understood that this is the method, we're using now our what we call heavy engineering vehicles that are leading this convoy of few units that are getting inside this area of fighting, and they scratch all the area. That means you destroy what we call civilian infrastructure without any other possibility, because you want to keep safe our troops and not to hit or to be hit because of uninvolved people that are living there.
Indeed. Well, let's turn now to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, namely Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you on two accounts. One, Mr. Oren, of course, referred to the Barak dome system or Iron Dome system on naval craft operating within the maritime sphere. But beyond that, the reports emerging about 1,307 projectiles being launched towards Israel from Lebanese territory during the month of August alone, marking the highest number in one single month that has been fired from Lebanese territory towards Israel. What are we to expect from Israel within this context to not only thwart those activities, but also to ensure that the residents of northern Israel, roughly 100 of them, remain displaced throughout other sectors of the country, will have the sense of security to be able to return home in any format?
Well, Jonathan, you're right about the last months, but we also have to remind everyone that from the beginning of the war, there are more than 6,000 rockets that were shot, rockets and projectiles that were shot from Lebanese territory by the Hezbollah toward Israel. So we're talking about significant numbers, and as you always mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is something that was done, initiated by the Hezbollah without any provocation or nothing like that. So this is really the situation when we're looking toward the north of Israel. With regard to the defense alternatives that we have, you're right about the new capabilities that we see today in the naval forces, in the Israeli naval forces. Some of it is a missile called Barak, made by IAI. The other one is the Iron Dome, which was made in a way that it would be part of a SAR 5 naval ship, the most, I would say, advanced SAR 5 and SAR 6, the most advanced ones. And this is made by Rafael. So, and indeed, this is something that was, I would say, thought about during the last 10 years. And here we see it operationally working. And from this point of view, sometimes we are very cynical about building the forces, about our governments, about our militaries, and so on. But I think that in the world of missile defense, we could be quite proud and say that there was a lot of thoughts that were put into it 10 and 15 years ago, what allowed us today to be with those capabilities. And we talked about the Iron Dome and naval capabilities, but also the David Sling, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, the multi-tier defense, and so on. Going back to Lebanon and to your direct question, the answer, unfortunately, is not to stay only on the defense. It is more strategic decision than, I would say, a military decision, strategic cabinet decision. Because, we could have the best interceptors, the best doctrines, and we always talk about it, that the doctrine is about attack, alert, active defense, and passive defense, all those together, which are minimizing the amount of casualties that we have in Israel. But at the end of the day, it comes to the strategy. And the question, if Israel is going to stay on the defense, active defense in the northern part of Israel, or we change its strategy and we counter the Hezbollah, I think that we are getting close to this point.
Thank you, General Gavish. Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask you, at a time when their negotiations are taking place in Cairo, with regard to a potential outline for a hostage release deal in exchange for the various Israeli concessions, which are a long list, of course, of various concessions. We see Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi travel to Ankara and meet with his Turkish counterpart, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, during the course of which they discussed a whole variety of issues, particularly also matters related to Libya, where they're on opposing sides, of course, of the equation, with the Turks supporting Tripoli as opposed to the Egyptians supporting General Haftar, or was he a colonel? I'm not sure already. He might have promoted himself to general at some point.
Field Marshal.
Field Marshal, there we go. Well, in any event, they also discussed, of course, also Sudan and Somalia, where they may have aligned interests, even though there seems to be some friction between the Turks and the Egyptians on this matter. But it seems like they are quite aligned as of late on matters related to the Gaza Strip. And while Turkey has been quite resolute in its rhetoric against Israel over matters related to the Gaza Strip and the Islamist Hamas in particular, being an Islamist ruling party in Turkey itself, the AKP namely. Nonetheless, I was quite alarmed by the statements made by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan last week on Friday when he addressed the commencement of the war colleges in Turkey, and he declared that Turkey will never turn its back on Jerusalem, that from its perspective, the city of Istanbul is as important as the city of Jerusalem, and made an emphasis of that time and again, that the Turkish government under him and Turkey as a whole will not relent until its military footprint is engulfed around the world. What are we to make out of those remarks?
Not much. If one recalls the rise of Egyptian nationalism in the 19th century was a reaction to Ottoman rule. And Egypt and Turkey are not natural allies. One can understand President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's concerns. He is disappointed, as we are, at Israel's inability to get a decisive victory fast. Egypt is, of course, very much concerned with instability in the region. You mentioned Libya. It also has problems in the Nile Valley, in Sudan, and all the way to Ethiopia. And just the other day, Prime Minister Netanyahu blamed Assisi without naming him personally, but he said President Mubarak, then the short-lived Morsi rule, and others. He blamed all of them for letting Hamas smuggle weapons through the tunnels into the Philadelphia corridor and beyond into Gaza. So obviously, Egypt is trying to hedge its bets. It doesn't want the war to go on. Also, one should always remember that Egypt is not only a mediator, it is a neighbor. It is not like Qatar or obviously the United States. It has a stake in what happens in the Sinai, where there are tribes with offshoots in Israel as well as in Gaza. And it wants the war to end. Maybe it will contribute forces for some multinational unit guarding the other side of the Philadelphia corridor.
Well, the question is whether all parties would agree to that, but that's already a different story. General Sofrin, when we're talking, though, on the broad scheme of things, obviously the impact, as Mr. Oren also correctly mentioned, to Egypt is quite significant. When we're talking about the Iranian grand strategy to imply or to employ additional pressures on various strategic points throughout the region, from Ansar Allah in Yemen to other activities that have to do, of course, also with the Gaza Strip, in particular with Sudan, with Somalia, also matters that are employing pressure from the north of Saudi Arabia, talking about Iraq, Hashd al-Shabi. All of this has various implications also for the Egyptians, including in Jordan proper. But when we look at the whole grand scheme of things from a strategic perspective, what can the United States do in collaboration with Israel to counter those challenges and alleviate concerns in Cairo, which are seemingly very real?
You know, there are always 2 or 3 options. The first one is to engage directly Iran. That means that if we all agree that Iran is what we call the head of the snake, and Iran is coordinating and activating all these proxies around, each one by its own limitation, by its own capabilities, and by its own interests, of course, but nevertheless, they succeeded in generating for 11 months what we call a multi-dimensional war all over the Middle East, orchestrated and led by Iran. Now, first of all, you can always try to apply pressure on Iran, and the fact that the American Navy, the 2 group carriers that are now in the Middle East, in addition to all these bombers and aircrafts and so on that are here around, it's for deterring Iran not to attack Israel, but nevertheless, it can be turned upside down. That means we, the Americans, can engage you Iranians if you escalate. Now, of course, this is not very realistic right now because of the campaign for presidency, which is in its final stage. And none of the nominees right now will be on the road to engage Iran and to get the US into a larger war that will affect, of course, what will be the future of these elections for presidency. So this is ruled out for the time being. The second issue is to try to give what we call a very, very determined hit on one of the main proxies, meaning Hezbollah, and by that signaling Iran that if you are trying to engage and trying to interfere, we are going to hit you as well as we hit Hezbollah. And by that to send a message to all these proxies around that not only us, but the Americans are around and they won't leave until everything is calmed down. It's complicated because the Iranians are going on. On one hand, they want to deal with Americans one more time about the nuclear agreement that was signed in 2015. But nevertheless, they keep on encouraging and leading all this multidimensional war against Israel. And of course, we have to decide our strategy because for the time being, we are fighting what we call kind of a tactical fighting. We're engaging Gaza on one hand, and this is the main effort. We're playing what we can kind of an active defense on the northern front. We're initiating activities in Judea and Samaria to try to unroot all these infrastructures and everything else that was built there. But it will take a very long time and will require a lot of units to be engaged for a very long time. And I don't see that we have any other strategy right now to change course and to go either to hit Hezbollah or to hit the Iranians.
Indeed. Well, you started your response by if we all agree. I think we all agree. Unfortunately, not everybody beyond those bounds agrees with the fact that the Islamic Republic is the main culprit. And even if they do agree, it has yet to pay a real price for its belligerent activities throughout the region, which is something that doesn't really give it a reason to stop with all of its malign activity. But General Kavish, we don't have very much time left, and I'd like to ask your perspective, since ultimately we're seeing the Iranians continuing to signal messages, be it on a direct attack against Israel, on a multi-front attack against Israel with various munitions. Of course, the question mark is whether they are deterred at this point in time or is just a temporary deterrence just to prepare for something of a larger scale. How can Israel maintain its heightened preparedness for any scenario for such a long period of time without taking into the equation other concerns related to these activities?
Well, Jonathan, the challenge with the deterrence is that you know that you are deterring someone until the moment that you're not deterring him, and this is really the challenging point. It's very hard to know if and how much the Iranians are deterred. We could say from one hand that for the first time during this war, they shot 300 projectiles toward Israel, never happened before. So maybe they are not deterred. We see what is happening toward from their proxies. We see the Houthis that are shooting towards the ships in the region. We see other proxies which are attacking directly the US forces, and everyone knows that this is coming with the support of Iran. So are they deterred? That's a very big question. Unfortunately, I don't think that they are very deterred. I think that they have a grand plan. I think that they are playing their cards with a lot of patience. Like we know from the history, they have a very impressive history, the Persians, and so they take their time. But when you look on the trends in the last, let's say even 1 year, we could say that unfortunately they are not deterred. And more than this, I mean, we talked about it and you discussed it not only in our show, in other shows also, about that, they are continuously going on and enlarging their influence also in Sudan and other places in Africa. So deterrence, I'm not sure that this is the situation. We go back to the grand strategy led by, of course, the United States, but the whole world and the coalition around, and the countries that are dealing with this, which is Israel and the other countries in the Mediterranean. I think that we all, as a coalition, must change our strategy toward Iran and really to bring it to a point that it would be deterred.
Iran must pay the price. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Gavish, General Soflin, and Mr. Oren for your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.
Jerusalem Studio, now available on Spotify.